This is HOA checkmate. I did not raise my voice. I raised my evidence packet. I drive a city bus in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which means I work odd hours, sleep odd hours, and park my car at odd hours. The Commons at Maplewood Landing Association does not care about my schedule. I pull into my assigned spot at 6 in the morning after an overnight shift, my eyes burning, my back aching. And before I even kill the engine, Ruth Stewart is speed-walking across the parking lot with a portable folding sign stand under one arm and a handheld label maker in the other hand. She is the community standards chair, which means she has invented her own job description and enforces rules that do not exist. She plants the sign stand 2 feet from my front bumper and starts snapping photos of my car with her phone. I climb out, still wearing my navy hoodie and red visor from the route, and I say, "What is the problem?" She does not look up. She says, "You are parked in a fire lane. This is a TOW on-site violation, and I am documenting this for the file." I look down. My car is inside the lines. The curb is painted yellow, but the actual ordinance says yellow curb means no stopping during business hours, and it is 6 in the morning. I say, "This is not a fire lane, and it is not business hours." She finally looks at me, and she smiles, and she says, "Smile. I am documenting this for the file." I moved to Sioux Falls 3 years ago for the bus job and bought a townhouse in Maplewood Landing because the price was right, and the HOA fees seemed reasonable. The neighborhood is the kind of place where the mailbox cluster is the unofficial courtroom, where every violation gets discussed in whispers, and every board meeting feels like a trial. The HOA name is on every sign, every notice, every email, like a brand that wants you to remember who is in charge. I am trying to finish a repair on my front steps before the weather changes, and the HOA has been blocking my contractor access for 2 weeks with vague permit complaints. Now Ruth is escalating. She stands up, taps something on her phone, and says, "I can make this a lean conversation in one email." I feel my stomach drop. I am in the middle of refinancing my mortgage, and any lien threat could blow up the deal. The closing timeline is tight, and my lender already warned me that any HOA red flags would delay everything. I take a breath and I say, "Show me the rule." She pulls a folded paper from her cardigan pocket and hands it to me. It is a printout of a complaint log entry, and the writing style is obviously hers, full of capitalized phrases and underlined warnings. It says my vehicle has been observed in unauthorized areas multiple times and that further violations will result in immediate towing and fines. I say, "This is not a rule. This is a complaint you wrote yourself." She snatches the paper back and she says, "The board approved updated guidelines last month, and you would know that if you attended meetings." I did attend the last meeting. There was no vote on fire lane policies. I tell her that, and she just smiles again and says, "Smile. I am documenting this for the file." She pulls out the handheld label maker and starts typing. I watch her print a small label strip, peel it, and walk over to stick it on my driver's side window. The label says nothing I can read from where I stand, but I know it is a violation tag. I say, "You cannot tag my car. I am not in violation." She ignores me, pulls out her phone again, and dials a number. I hear her say, "Yes, this is Ruth Stewart with the Commons at Maplewood Landing Association. I need a tow for an unauthorized vehicle in a fire lane. The address is." And I step forward and I say, "Do not call a tow company. I am parked legally." She holds up one finger to shush me and finishes the call. Then she hangs up and she says, "The truck will be here in 20 minutes, and if you want to avoid the fees, you can move your car now and pay the fine later." I say, "I am not paying a fine for a rule that does not exist." She shrugs and says, "Then enjoy the tow yard." I go inside, drop my keys on the counter, and I call my neighbor, Marcus. Marcus is an HOA homeowner who is popular, the kind of guy everyone likes because he grills for the block parties and helps people move furniture. He has been in the neighborhood for a decade, and he knows every board member by name. I tell him what just happened, and he says, "Ruth has been pulling this garbage for 6 months. She tags cars in guest parking and then calls her favorite tow vendor, and the HOA gets a kickback." I say, "Are you serious?" He says, "I am serious, and I have been trying to get people to vote her out. but she controls the compliance committee and she writes the meeting agendas. He says he will come over and be a witness if the tow truck shows up. I thank him, and I go back outside. Ruth is still there, leaning against the folding sign stand, tapping on her phone. I walk past her to check the curb paint myself. The yellow paint is fresh, but the actual city ordinance sign is 50 feet away, and it clearly states no stopping from 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening Monday through Friday. It is 6:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. I take a photo of the sign with my phone, and I take a photo of the curb, and I take a photo of my car inside the lines. Ruth sees me and she says, "Photos will not help you. The HOA has its own rules." I say, "The HOA cannot override city ordinance." She laughs and says, "Watch me." 20 minutes later, a tow truck pulls into the lot. The driver is a young guy with a company polo and a clipboard. He climbs out and Ruth waves him over like she is directing traffic. She points at my car and she says, "That one, fire lane violation. The board authorized immediate removal." The driver walks over, looks at the curb, looks at the parking lines, and he says, "This does not look like a fire lane." Ruth snaps, "It is a fire lane. The association has updated the markings, and you are contracted to remove violations on site." The driver frowns and says, "I need to see the authorization." Ruth pulls out her phone and shows him something, and I cannot see what it is, but the driver shrugs and says, "All right, I will hook it up." I step forward and I say, "Hold on, I have proof this is not a violation." I show him the photos of the ordinance sign and the curb. I say, "The city code is clear, and the HOA cannot override it." He looks at the photos, looks at Ruth, and he says, "I am not getting in the middle of this. If you two want to fight it out, do it after I tow." I say, "If you tow my car when I am legally parked, I will file a complaint with the city and your company, and I will make sure you lose the contract." He pauses. Ruth says, "Ignore him. He is bluffing." I say, "Try me." The driver looks at me, then at Ruth, then back at me. He says, "I am going to call my supervisor." He walks back to his truck and makes a call. Ruth glares at me, and she says, "You are making this worse for yourself. I can add obstruction to the file." I say, "You can add whatever you want, but you are going to have to prove it." Marcus pulls up in his car and parks 2 spots over. He gets out, walks over, and he says, "Hey, Ruth, what is going on?" She stiffens and she says, "This does not concern you, Marcus." He smiles and says, "I live here, everything concerns me." He looks at my car, looks at the curb, and he says, "This is not a fire lane, Ruth, you know that." She says, "The board approved new markings." Marcus says, "I was at the last board meeting, there was no vote on fire lane markings, and you know it." She turns red and she says, "The vote was in executive session." Marcus laughs and says, "Executive sessions are for lawsuits and personnel, not parking enforcement, and you know that too." The driver comes back and he says, "My supervisor says, if there is a dispute, we do not tow until it is resolved, sorry." Ruth says, "You are in breach of contract." The driver says, "Then take it up with the office. I am not hooking the car." He climbs back into the truck and drives off. Ruth is shaking now, and she points at me and she says, "This is not over. I will have an attorney letter on your door by tomorrow, and when the lien hits, you will wish you had just paid the fine." I do not say anything. I just watch her pick up her folding sign stand and walk away, the label maker swinging from a strap on her wrist. Marcus waits until she is out of earshot, and he says, "She is serious. She has done this before. She will send you a fake attorney letter to scare you into paying." I say, "Let her try." He says, "You need to document everything. Every email, every notice, every interaction, because she will lie in the board meeting and the management company will back her up." I say, "I am already on it." He claps me on the shoulder and says, "Good, because you are going to need it." I go inside and I write an email to the HOA management company. I attach the photos, I cite the city ordinance, and I request a written explanation of the fire lane policy. I send it, and I copy the entire board. Then I sit down at my kitchen table and I start going through my HOA documents, the governing documents, the bylaws, the meeting minutes, everything. I am looking for any mention of fire lane policies or updated parking enforcement. I do not find anything. What I do find is a budget line item for towing vendor services that is 3 times higher than last year, and a note in the March meeting minutes that says the board approved a new towing contract with a vendor that Ruth recommended. I take a screenshot of that page. I am starting to see the shape of this thing. Ruth is not enforcing rules. She is running a scam, and the HOA is either in on it or too lazy to stop her. That afternoon, I get a reply from the management company. It is a 2-sentence email that says they have forwarded my inquiry to the compliance committee, and I should expect a response within 10 business days. 10 business days is too long. My refinance closes in 3 weeks, and if Ruth files a lien in the meantime, the deal dies. I call the management company directly. The receptionist says the property manager is in meetings all day and cannot take calls. I say, "This is urgent. I need to speak to someone about a false lien threat." She puts me on hold for 5 minutes, then comes back and says the manager will call me tomorrow. I hang up, and I call my real estate attorney, the one who handled my purchase. I explain the situation, and she says, if the HOA files a lien without proper notice and without a valid violation, you can fight it, but it will take time, and your lender will not wait. She says the best move is to force the HOA to back down before they file anything. I say, how? She says, show up at the next board meeting with your evidence and make them vote on the record. I say the next meeting is not for 2 weeks. She says, then request an emergency hearing. The bylaws usually allow it if there is a financial dispute. I thank her and I hang up, and I draft an email requesting an emergency hearing under the bylaws. I cite the false violation, the lien threat, and the tight refinance timeline. I send it to the board and the management company. Then, I wait. 2 days later, I get a letter in the mail. It is from a law firm I have never heard of, and the letterhead looks official, but the language is pure bluff. It says I am in violation of HOA parking policies. I owe a $200 fine, plus a $50 administrative fee, and if I do not pay within 5 days, the HOA will proceed with lien action, and I will be responsible for all attorney fees and court costs. The letter is signed by someone named J. Harrison Keller, attorney at law. I look up the firm online. The address is a mailbox store. The phone number goes to voicemail. I call my attorney, and I read her the letter. She laughs and she says, "This is not a real law firm. This is a scare letter, probably drafted by Ruth herself or some vendor she uses. Ignore it and keep building your case." I say, "Should I respond?" She says, "No. Do not engage. Just document it and add it to your evidence pile." I take a photo of the letter and I file it in a folder on my laptop labeled HOA Abuse. The next morning, I am in the kitchen making coffee when I hear a loud snap outside. I look out the window and I see a man in a reflective vest crouched beside my car, and there is a bright orange boot clamp locked around my front driver's side wheel. I drop the coffee mug in the sink and I run outside. The man stands up, holding a clipboard, and he says, "Vehicle is immobilized for unpaid fines. You can call this number to arrange payment and removal." I say, "I do not have any unpaid fines. This is harassment." He shrugs and says, "I just installed the boots. You have to talk to the HOA." He hands me a slip of paper with a phone number and walks back to a white van parked across the lot. I look at the boot. It is a heavy steel clamp with a bright orange safety lock and a warning sticker that says removal by anyone other than authorized personnel is a criminal offense. I take photos from every angle. Then I call the number on the slip. It rings 4 times, and Ruth answers. She says compliance office. I say, "Ruth, I know this is you. Remove the boot from my car right now." She says, "Payment is due before removal. The fine is now $300 because you ignored the attorney letter, and there is a $75 boot fee." I say, "I am not paying fraudulent fines, and if you do not remove the boot, I am calling the police." She says, go ahead. They will tell you this is a civil matter, and by the time you fight it, your refinance will be dead, and you will owe twice as much. Then she hangs up. I call the police non-emergency line. The dispatcher listens to my story and says an officer will come by to take a report. I say, can they remove the boot? She says, no, that is a civil dispute. The officer can document it, but cannot remove property. I hang up, and I call Marcus. He says he will be right over. Then I call my attorney, and I leave a voicemail explaining what happened. I go back outside, and I stand next to my car, waiting. Two neighbors are walking past, and they stop and whisper to each other, pointing at the boot. One of them, an older woman named Carol, walks over and says, "Is this Ruth again?" I say yes. She shakes her head and says, "She did this to my son last year. He had to pay $200 to get his car back, and the HOA never gave him a receipt." I say, "Did he fight it?" She says no. He just paid and moved out. I say, "I am not moving out." She smiles and says, "Good. Someone needs to stand up to her." A police officer arrives about 20 minutes later. He is young, polite, and clearly does not want to be here. He takes my statement, looks at the boot, takes photos, and says, "This is a civil matter. I cannot remove the boot, but I will file a report and you can use it if you go to court." I say, "Can you at least confirm that I am parked legally?" He looks at the curb, looks at the ordinance sign down the street, and he says, "According to city code, you are parked legally. The yellow curb restriction does not apply at this hour." I say, "Can you put that in the report?" He says yes. I thank him and he leaves. Marcus shows up right as the officer is pulling away. He looks at the boot and he says, "This is insane." I say, "She is trying to force me to pay before the board meeting." He says, "She is trying to force you to pay, period. Because if you do, you admit the violation, and then she wins." I say, "I am not paying." He says, "Then we need to go on offense." If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories where the tables turn. Marcus says, "You need to record everything from now on. Every interaction, every phone call, every board meeting. Because Ruth will lie, and the management company will protect her, unless you have proof." I say, "I have been taking photos." He says, "Photos are good, but audio is better. This is a one-party consent state. You can record anyone as long as you are part of the conversation." I say, "How does that help?" He says, "Get her to admit on tape that she is enforcing rules that do not exist. Or get her to admit the real reason she is targeting you, and then you have leverage." I say, "She is not going to admit anything to me." He says, "She might admit it to someone else, someone she thinks is on her side." He pulls out his phone and he says, "I am going to text a few people. There is a group of us who are sick of her. And we have been collecting stories. If we can get her on tape saying the wrong thing, we can force the board to remove her." I say, "Do you think it will work?" He says, "I do not know, but it is better than sitting here with a boot on your car." That night, I get an email from the HOA management company. It says my request for an emergency hearing has been denied because the bylaws require a 30-day notice period for special meetings unless there is a quorum vote to waive it, and the board does not have a quorum until the regular meeting in 2 weeks. The email also says I have been assessed a $300 fine for the parking violation and a $75 boot fee, and payment is due within 5 days or the HOA will proceed with lien action. I forward the email to my attorney. She calls me within an hour and she says, "This is bad. They are trying to run out the clock. You need to escalate now." I say, "How?" She says, "File a complaint with the state. HOAs are regulated, and if they are denying you due process, the state can intervene." I say, "How long does that take?" She says, "Weeks, maybe months, too long for your refinance." I say, "Then what?" She says, "You need to force their hand, show up at the management company office with your evidence, and demand a meeting. Make them deal with you in person and record everything. I say, will that work? She says, maybe, or they will call the police and have you trespassed, but at this point you do not have a lot of options. The next morning, I drive to the management company office. My car still has the boot on it, so I borrow Marcus's car. The office is in a strip mall on the south side of town, next to a tax service and a vape shop. I walk in and the receptionist looks up and says, "Do you have an appointment?" I say no, but I need to speak to the property manager about the commons at Maplewood Landing Association. It is urgent. She says, "He is in a meeting." I say I will wait. She frowns and picks up the phone. She has a quiet conversation, hangs up and says, "He can give you 5 minutes." I say, "Thank you." She points to a door behind her desk and says, "Go ahead." The property manager is a man in his 50s with a cheap suit and a cluttered desk. His name is on a placard, but I cannot read it from where I stand. He does not stand up when I walk in. He says, "What can I do for you?" I say, "I am a homeowner at Maplewood Landing, and your compliance chair, Ruth Stewart, has been harassing me with fake violations, fake attorney letters, and now a boot on my car, and I need you to fix it." He leans back in his chair and says, "Ruth is following the procedures outlined in the governing documents. If you have a dispute, you can address it at the next board meeting." I say, "The next board meeting is in 2 weeks, and she is threatening to file a lien that will kill my refinance. I need this resolved now." He says, "I cannot override the board." I say, "You can call an emergency meeting." He says, "The bylaws require 30 days notice." I say, "The bylaws also allow the board to waive that with a quorum vote, so call a vote." He says, "The board does not have a quorum until the regular meeting." I pull out my phone and I say, "I am recording this conversation, and I am asking you again, will you call an emergency meeting to address a violation that does not exist, and a lien threat that violates my due process rights?" He stares at me, and his face goes red, and he says, "You need to leave." I say, "Not until you answer the question." He picks up his desk phone, and he says, "I am calling the police." I say, "Go ahead, I will tell them the same thing I am telling you. Your compliance chair is running a scam, and you are covering for her." He does not call the police. He sets the phone down, and he says, "What do you want?" I say, "I want the boot removed. I want the fines dropped. I want a written confirmation that I am not in violation. And I want Ruth removed from the compliance committee." He laughs and says, "I cannot do any of that." I say, "Then I will file a complaint with the state. I will file a complaint with the Better Business Bureau. I will post this recording online, and I will make sure every homeowner in the association knows that you are letting Ruth run a towing scam for kickbacks." He stops laughing. He says, "You do not have proof of kickbacks." I say, "I have the budget reports, I have the meeting minutes, I have the vendor contract, and I have witnesses who will testify that Ruth is targeting people who ask questions." He stares at me for a long moment. Then he says, "I will talk to Ruth." I say, "That is not good enough." He says, "It is all I can offer." I say, "Then I will see you in court." I turn and walk out. When I get back to Marcus's car, I sit in the parking lot and I call my attorney. I tell her what happened and she says, "Good, you put him on notice. Now he has to cover himself. And that means he will either rein Ruth in or throw her under the bus." I say, "Which one?" She says, "Probably neither. He will try to stall and hope you give up, but you rattled him, and that is a win." I say, "What is next?" She says, "You need to get Ruth on tape admitting something. Anything that proves she knows the rules do not support her enforcement. And then you take that to the board meeting and you force a vote." I say, "How do I get her on tape?" She says, "Bait her. Make her angry. Angry people say stupid things." I thank her and I hang up, and I drive back to Maplewood Landing. The boot is still on my car. I take another photo and I post it to the neighborhood Facebook group with a caption that says, "Does anyone know why the HOA is booting legally parked cars? I would love to understand the policy." Within an hour, I have 20 comments. Most of them are people saying they have had similar problems with Ruth. One person says Ruth told her the guest parking rules changed, and she had to pay a $50 fine for letting her mother park overnight. Another person says Ruth tagged his car for not having a current registration sticker, even though his registration was current and the sticker was on the plate. A third person says Ruth called a tow truck on his teenage daughter, and the truck showed up at 2 in the morning. I screenshot all the comments, and I save them in my evidence folder. That evening, Ruth shows up at my door. She is holding a clipboard, and her label maker is hanging from her wrist. She says, "I saw your post, and I am here to inform you that using social media to harass board members is a violation of the community conduct policy, and you will be fined accordingly." I say I did not harass anyone. I asked a question. She says, "You implied that I am acting improperly, and that is defamation." I pull out my phone and I start recording. I say, "I am recording this conversation, and I am asking you to explain the fire lane policy that you claim I violated." She sees the phone and her face goes tight. She says, "Put that away." I say, "No, this is my property, I can record, now explain the policy." She says, "The policy is in the updated guidelines." I say, "Show me the guidelines." She says, "They are on file with the management company." I say, "I requested a copy, and they said no such guidelines exist." She says, "Then you did not request properly." I say, "Or they do not exist." She steps closer and she says, "Smile. I am documenting this for the file." I say, "Good. Document this. You are enforcing rules that do not exist, you are threatening liens to extort money, and you are running a scam with the towing vendor." Her face goes red and she says, "You have no proof of that." I say I have the budget reports, I have the vendor contract, I have the meeting minutes, and I have 20 neighbors who are ready to testify that you have been doing this for months. She says, "Those people are liars." I say, "Then prove it. Show me the policy." She turns and walks away, and as she goes, she says, "You will regret this." 2 days later, I get a notice taped to my door. It is a formal violation notice, printed on HOA letterhead, and it says I have been cited for harassment of a board member, disruptive conduct, and misuse of association communication platforms. The fine is $500, and payment is due within 5 days. I take a photo of the notice, and I send it to my attorney. She calls me back and she says, "This is retaliation, and it is illegal under most HOA statutes. You need to file a formal complaint with the board and demand a hearing." I say, "They already denied my emergency hearing request." She says, "This is different. This is a disciplinary action, and the bylaws require them to give you a hearing before imposing fines. If they do not, you can sue and you will win." I say, "How long does that take?" She says, "Months, and it will cost you thousands in legal fees. But the good news is, if you win, they have to pay your fees." I say, "I do not have months." She says, "Then you need to settle, or you need to force them to drop it by making the fight more expensive than it is worth." That night, Marcus calls me. He says, "I got something." I say, "What?" He says, "I recorded a conversation with Ruth. She was at the mailbox cluster, and I asked her about the parking enforcement. And she said the board does not actually review the violations, she just submits them, and the management company processes the fines automatically. And she said she has been tagging cars that belong to people who complain at meetings, because it keeps them quiet." I say, "Did she say that on tape?" He says, "Yes. I will send you the file." I say, "This is huge." He says, "I know. But you need to be careful. If she finds out I recorded her, she will come after me too." I say, "I will protect the source. I will just say I have a recording." He says, "Good. because I do not want to be the next person with a boot on my car. I listened to the recording 3 times. Ruth's voice is clear, and her words are damning. She says the board does not review violations. She says she targets people who complain. And she says the management company processes fines automatically without checking the validity. I send the file to my attorney, and I say, "Is this enough?" She says, "This is more than enough. This proves selective enforcement, retaliation, and denial of due process. You can use this to force the board to drop all the fines and remove Ruth from the committee. And if they refuse, you can sue, and you will win." I say, "What about the lien threat?" She says, "If they try to file a lien after you present this, they are opening themselves up to punitive damages. No competent attorney would let them do it." I say, "So what is the play?" She says, "Go to the next board meeting, play the recording, demand a vote to remove Ruth and drop the fines. And if they refuse, walk out and file a lawsuit the next day." I say, "Will they vote?" She says, "If they are smart, yes, because the alternative is a lawsuit they will lose and legal fees that will eat their budget." The board meeting is on a Thursday night at 7. I show up at 6:45 with a laptop, a portable speaker, and a folder full of printed evidence. Marcus is already there, along with Carol and a dozen other neighbors who have been following the drama on Facebook. Ruth is sitting at the front table with the board president and the management company property manager. She sees me walk in and her face goes tight. The board president calls the meeting to order and says, "We have a full agenda tonight. Please hold your questions until the public comment period." I raise my hand and I say, "I have a formal complaint that needs to be addressed immediately." He says, "You can bring it up during public comment." I say, "This is time sensitive, it involves retaliation and denial of due process, and I have evidence." He looks at the property manager, and the property manager says, "Let him speak." The board president sighs and says, "You have 5 minutes." I stand up and I say, "Ruth Stewart has been harassing me with fake violations, fake attorney letters, and a boot on my car, and I have evidence that she is targeting homeowners who complain at meetings, that she is running a scam with the towing vendor, and that the management company is processing fines without reviewing them." Ruth stands up and she says, "This is defamation, and I demand that he be removed." The board president says, "Sit down, Ruth. He has the floor." I pull out my laptop and I connect it to the speaker. I say, "I have a recording of Ruth admitting that the board does not review violations and that she targets people who complain." I hit play. Ruth's voice fills the room, clear and damning. She says, "The board does not actually review the violations. I just submit them, and the management company processes the fines automatically. And I have been tagging cars that belong to people who complain at meetings because it keeps them quiet." The room goes silent. Ruth's face is white. The board president looks at the property manager, and the property manager looks at the floor. I stop the recording and I say, "I also have budget reports showing that the towing vendor contract was approved without competitive bidding. I have meeting minutes showing that Ruth pushed the contract through without proper notice. And I have 20 neighbors who are ready to testify that Ruth has been doing this for months. I demand that the board drop all fines against me, remove the boot from my car, and remove Ruth from the compliance committee." The board president says, "We will take this under advisement." I say, "No, I want to vote tonight." He says, "We need time to review the evidence." I say, "You just heard the evidence, and if you do not vote tonight, I am filing a lawsuit tomorrow, and I will make sure every homeowner knows that this board allowed Ruth to run a scam and retaliated against anyone who spoke up." Marcus stands up and says, "I move that Ruth Stewart be removed from the compliance committee immediately." Carol stands up and says, "I second." The board president looks at Ruth, and Ruth says, "This is a witch hunt." The board president says, "Ruth, you admitted on tape that you target people who complain. That is retaliation, and it is illegal." Ruth says I was taken out of context. The board president says there is no context that makes that okay. He looks at the other board members and he says, "All in favor of removing Ruth Stewart from the compliance committee, raise your hand." 4 hands go up. Ruth does not raise her hand. The board president says, "Motion passes." Ruth stands up and she says, "You are all going to regret this." She grabs her clipboard and her label maker and she walks out. The room erupts in applause. The board president waits for the noise to die down and he says, "We will also need to review the fines and the boot." I say, "The fines are fraudulent. The boot is illegal. And I want them dropped tonight." The property manager stands up and he says, "We will drop the fines and remove the boot tomorrow morning." I say, "Tonight." He says, "The boot vendor does not work nights." I say, "Then call him and pay him extra, because if that boot is still in my car tomorrow, I am filing a police report for theft and vandalism." He pulls out his phone and makes a call. He has a quiet conversation, hangs up and says, "The vendor will be there in an hour." I say, "Thank you." The board president says, "Is there anything else?" I say, "Yes. I want a written confirmation that I am not in violation, and I want the HOA to pay my filing fees if I have to take this to court." He looks at the property manager, and the property manager says, "We will provide the written confirmation, and we will reimburse your filing fees if you have receipts." I say, "Good." The board president says, "Meeting adjourned." I walk out of the meeting, and Marcus claps me on the back. He says, "You did it." I say, "Not yet. The boot is still on my car." He says, "It will be gone in an hour, and Ruth is done. She cannot touch you now." I say, "She can still cause trouble." He says, "Maybe, but she has no power, and everyone knows what she did. She is finished." I say, "Good." We walk outside, and the vendor is already there, crouched beside my car with a tool, unlocking the boot. He pulls it off, loads it into his van, and drives away. I stand there for a moment, looking at my car, and I feel a weight lift off my shoulders. Then I go inside, make a cup of coffee, and I sit down at my kitchen table. I open my laptop, and I start drafting a formal complaint to the state HOA regulator. I attach the recording, the budget reports, the meeting minutes, and a summary of everything that happened. I hit send. Then I close the laptop, and I go to bed. 3 weeks later, I get a letter from the state HOA regulator. It says they have opened an investigation into the Commons at Maplewood Landing Association for selective enforcement, retaliation, and financial mismanagement. The letter also says Ruth Stewart has been banned from holding any position in the association pending the outcome of the investigation. I forward the letter to my attorney, and she calls me back. She says this is the best possible outcome. The state will audit the HOA. They will find the kickback arrangement with the towing vendor, and they will force the board to implement proper procedures. I say, "What about Ruth?" She says, if the investigation finds evidence of fraud, she could face criminal charges, but at a minimum, she will never work in HOA management again. I say, "Good." She says, "And your refinance." I say, "It closed yesterday. No lien, no issues." She says, "Congratulations." I say, "Thank you. I could not have done it without your help." She says, "You did all the work. I just pointed you in the right direction." A month later, I see Ruth at the grocery store. She is walking toward the exit with a cart full of bags, and she sees me in the produce section. She stops, and for a moment I think she is going to say something, but instead she just turns and pushes her cart in the other direction. I do not follow her. I just finish my shopping, check out, and drive home. When I pull into my parking spot at Maplewood Landing, I see Marcus standing by the mailbox cluster, talking to Carol and a few other neighbors. He waves me over and says, "Did you hear the news?" I say, "What news?" He says, "The board voted to terminate the contract with the towing vendor and hire a new management company, and they are rewriting the parking enforcement policy to require board approval for every violation." I say, "That is great." He says, "It is because of you. You forced them to clean house." I say, "It was not just me. You helped. Carol helped. Everyone who spoke up helped. He smiles and says, "Still, you were the one who did not back down, and that matters." I go inside, and I sit down at my kitchen table. I open my laptop, and I look at the folder labeled HOA Abuse. It is full of photos, emails, recordings, and documents. I close the folder, and I delete it. I do not need it anymore. Then I open a new browser tab, and I search for how to run for HOA board. The next election is in 6 months, and I am going to run. If I learned anything from this mess, it is that the only way to fix a bad HOA is to get involved and change it from the inside. I do not know if I will win, but I am going to try. Because no one should have to go through what I went through just to park their car in their own neighborhood. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.